So thank you so much again for agreeing to doing this and finding the time. I'm interviewing Professor John Major. And as I mentioned, I'm a very big fan of The Origins, the podcast with Lawrence Cross. And so that's where I would like to start from with you too. What are your origins? When did you think you started, if you look back in retrospect, when do you think there was a moment that determined you becoming a professor of Chinese studies? Because it wasn't very common.
Yeah, that has actually a very distinct and clear starting point. I was an undergraduate at Haverford College, and my freshman year, I took the standard Western survey history from Roman Empire to the Reformation. And the course was brilliantly taught. It was really a revelation to me that history could be so interesting. At the end of that year, I said to the professor that if history was like that, I was going to be a history major. And he said in a very offhand way, he was glad to hear that, but I shouldn't confine myself to the Western tradition. He said, if you don't have anything else to do this summer, why don't you get some books on China and read them? And that seemed like a good idea. And I read a few books on China and realized that here was a high civilization that I knew nothing about, that owed nothing to the Abrahamic religions or to the Greco-Roman tradition. So I said, I need to find out more about this. So I just kept going and started Chinese and was pretty good at that. And that seemed like a natural path. But it's
so you started from the language? I
yeah,
mean, from reading these groups and the language?
that's right. I realized that that was going to be the test. If I could do Chinese, I had a career ahead of me. If I was no good at Chinese, I had to do something else. And of course, my friends all thought I was crazy. Why study Chinese? What's the point of that? So I applied to graduate school. I got in at Harvard, and it's funny. I thought I was going to do modern China at first, and then when the Chinese got good enough to read modern political documents, I said, God, I can't spend my life reading this stuff. This is awful. But I was lucky enough to study with Dirk Bada at the University of Pennsylvania. And he propelled me back to the Han Dynasty, and I stayed there for the rest of my career. And it was a good choice.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it served you well. I'm curious about the books that you started reading that summer. Do you remember which ones they were? Because again, China wasn't that common as a topic to study back then. So
I don't remember all of them, but two that I do remember was this Survey History of China by Kenneth Latourette, which is now completely obsolete, but was the standard textbook at that time. This was in 1960. And another was a recent book by Ben Schwartz, Chinese Communism and the Rise of Mao, which still holds up very well. And there were a couple of others, but I don't remember them. But it was enough to whet my curiosity. But the whole thing was an accident. It was just an offhand remark. And I've often thought if my biology professor had said, why don't you go to Africa and study baboons? I would have been a wildlife biologist. I was just looking for something to do, and that suggestion came at the right time.
why do you think you wanted something to do outside the Western culture? You were studying European history, right?
Yeah.
But it seemed that you were also looking for something else.
Yeah, it seemed to me that as I looked over the span of Chinese history, the Han Dynasty really was a crucial step. And for my senior thesis, I wrote on Deng Zhongshu and the Chunqiu Fanlu. And interesting because I spent some years in the later part of my career translating that with Sarah Queen. So there's a kind of rounding off of my career. Start with the one book and end with that same book, or almost end. But the Han Dynasty was very attractive, and I had very good mentors for that. I studied with Yu Yingshi and L.S. Yang, and Ben Schwartz at Harvard, and Nathan Simmon, who at that time was at MIT. And I read Chinese science with him, and that's when I started with the White Answer. Nathan assigned me a portion of White Answer Chapter 4 to do as my term paper for that Chinese science course. And that was my first little piece of the White Answer. And that became the focus of my career. And
that stayed with you a lot too, yes.
yeah. And working on that put a lot of intellectual capital in the bank for me. I had a storehouse of information and interpretation that I could draw on for a long time. And so that was a good career choice. And it enabled me to have an academic career, even as you know, when I left the academic world, but I didn't leave the world of scholarship.
Yes, I want to go back to that because that's one of the two reasons why it makes you famous is not just your research, but also this particular career path. But before going that, I wanted to hear more about mentors. So we all know, being brilliant is must be also put together with having great mentors. Mentors who push you, mentors who just give you the right book at the right time. And you mentioned a few very important names in the field of Chinese studies. But what do you think they gave you besides insights into the scholarship? Did they shape you who you were as a scholar?
They taught me a lot about scholarship and what scholarship is for, and how one comports oneself as a scholar. And so they were personal examples of people who were deeply involved in their research, but also were very caring and empathetic human beings, and who, by example, showed how you get along with your colleagues and how you nurture your students. And those were all very important things. It might have happened in other fields as well, but I was fortunate at Harvard to belong to a cohort of very good students, graduate students. It was just the time of the National Defense Foreign Language Initiative, so there was government support for us. It was a time when China was beginning to seem much more interesting, and a little bit of news that we had filtering out during the Cultural Revolution. And so there was a good body of graduate students to interact with, and we supported one another. And that has lasted for a long time.
Who were your colleagues?
Well, Michael Dalby, who wound up leading the profession, but who had done Tang studies for a while. Robin Yates, very good friend for life. Elling Ide was a junior fellow at Harvard when I was a graduate student, and I got to know Elling very well. Sophie Sa, who did Mongolian studies and then entered the philanthropic world. So Jamie Pusey, a bunch of very interesting people, and it was great to be part of that.
I want to ask, since you mentioned that these mentors also sort of taught you what scholarship is for. So I think we live also in a time when there is a bit this question of what is scholarship, and particularly in the humanities, what is scholarship for?
It helps you to understand what's going on in the world today. There's no direct line from the Han Dynasty to political issues today, but there's an indirect line. During the Han Dynasty, that trade through Central Asia along the so-called Silk Route got going, and now we have the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can't understand the Belt and Road Initiative or the claims of China to the South China Sea without understanding the historical background. They don't come out of nowhere. And the claims to sovereignty and the claims to dominance that we now see China making have their roots in the Han Dynasty. with Jiang Chen and the expedition to the West and the extension of Han power out into Central Asia. And all of those things are relevant. But even if they weren't relevant, it is good to know things. And sometimes scholarship has no purpose than to find out new things or to understand old things. And sooner or later, someone will value that. I don't know who is going to read my and Sarah's translation of the Spiritual Lu, but someone will. And maybe use that as a launching pad for some other kind of understanding. So it takes a certain amount of faith to do scholarship, because some of it you're just flinging it out into the winds and hope it will blow somewhere useful.
Yes, I have to say that I can understand that being, a young scholar who's trying to, do something that someone one day will pick up and read. Yeah, no, that's also why I asked that provocative question. I'm also curious about your position in saying the Han Dynasty is such a fundamental moment in the course of Chinese history. Not because I disagree necessarily, but you would have professors saying that the Qin dynasty was actually what started it. You would have other scholars believing that the Eastern Zhou dynasty was actually what gave rise to many of the things that followed, and so on and so forth. So what made it, what do you think is so fundamental in the sense that it created a foundation in the Han Dynasty?
Well, of course, it drew on intellectual currents from the Warring States period and rituals going back to the Western Zhou. All of that is relevant, but the Han struck me as very interesting because it was a time when Chinese intellectuals were really trying to figure things out and understand how the world worked and what the role of humans was in the world at large. So that kind of intellectual history really intrigued me. And of course, as I said, you have to have background for that, and that involves going back further into historical periods. But you can't do everything, and so that one focus seems to serve me well.
I actually wanted to bring up this aspect that you not only you studied, you had a lot of this scholarship that goes very much in depth into topics, but you're also very, very broad. You covered so many topics. I was writing them down. So you talk about Zhuangzi, so the philosophers, but also what is a myth, what is the myth in ancient China, true religion, numerology, animals. I found this paper I didn't know about, very interesting, titled New Light on the Dark Warrior. And you wrote about the Chunchi Falio and the Huainanzi. This may come across as a bit of a silly question, but as I mentioned, I'm a young scholar, starting in the field, trying to find a position for myself. How does one, produce so much on so many topics with such intelligence? I sometimes I have the feeling, that just to get to know one text and to read it properly and to understand it and to contextualize it, it takes forever. So do you have a secret to share with us, students?
I just work hard.
Okay.
I had a couple of good examples in my own family. I have two older brothers. Both of them got PhDs. The oldest one in chemistry and the middle one in economics. So a scholarly career was very much present in my mind, and also the value of hard work. It does take work, and learning at an early age to take work seriously and to accomplish things was an important part of my upbringing. And also, I was very lucky with the Huainanzi. It's a remarkable text. And as I said, working on that put ideas in the bank for me, and I could draw on those ideas for decades afterwards. For the rest, I suppose, in large part curiosity. Something seems interesting and you follow it.
You chose what seems what was at the time a sort of unconventional path compared to your siblings. So I was just curious if there were, what was the reaction of your siblings towards your choice of topic?
My father was very good about that. He said, Johnny, you can study anything you want and you can have any career you want, just be good at it. So that was very inspiring.
Yeah, very supportive too.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to this very particular career you had, where you started being, like a regular academic job in a sense, but then you quit and you went to do something else, right?
Yeah. Yeah, what happened is my wife finished her doctorate in 1983, and that was in modern European cultural history with an emphasis on the history of fashion. And it's a very unusual topic, and it was one where the field hardly existed at that time. And there was nothing for her to do at Dartmouth. There was no career possibility there. So it was time to launch her career, and that meant moving to New York. So I resigned from the Dartmouth faculty and looked for jobs in the New York area. And there were no senior positions in Chinese history available in that year. So I had to do something else, and I wound up working for the Asia Society for a few years. And then when it became clear that that was not going to be a very good career path, I took a day job, as you know, as senior editor at the Book of the Month Club, and used that as a way of earning a living that was interesting and stimulating, but not too exhausting. I could do that job very easily without too much effort. And that left me time for scholarship. And for many years while I was in that situation of having a day job, I would come home from work at 5:30 and cook supper. I'm the cook of the family, and have a little family time with my wife and our son. And then from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, I went and studied and worked. So you do that every night, you get a lot done. Now I couldn't do it. I've gotten old and tired, and I don't have the stamina for that kind of work anymore. But for a long time, that was my pattern of working, and that turned out very well. And in fact, leaving the academic world was really liberating for me, because it allowed me to do kinds of writing that would be disesteemed in the academic world. If I had stayed as a tenured faculty member at Dartmouth and wrote children's books, people would say, "Why are you wasting your time on that? You should be doing scholarship." But on my own, I was my own boss. And if I wanted to write a children's book, I did. If I wanted to write for young adults, I did. If I wanted to spend some time with my brothers writing family history, that's okay too. If I wanted to edit an anthology of poetry, why not? So it gave me a tremendous amount of scope to pursue interests and to pursue exploratory work that I would not have been able to do if I had stayed on the faculty.
Yes, when I was researching something about your life, who you were to find questions for this interview, I saw that there was such a variety of books coming up with your name. I thought it was a case of that. And then I realized maybe not. Maybe it's actually because of this very particular career. I have one question regarding, so this flexibility that you had and the fact that you were reading books, right? Every kind of book that was just put on your desk, you had to read it and review it.
That's right.
Did that help with the scholarship? Was it, did it help your writing? Did it help you coming up with new ideas? Or No,
Indirectly.
really.
Yeah, indirectly. Certainly coming up with new ideas and learning new information. I was reading a broad range of books, and particularly in history and history of science. And so I found a lot of stimulation from that. Of course, there were hundreds of bad books that just went in one ear and out the other. But sometimes there were books that really contributed to my interests and to open up new pathways for me. And yeah, it was a good job.
I remember when we met the first time in New York, you
Yeah.
told me about this very intelligent advertisement where there was the picture of you, and then it was written, "You don't have to add 3 bad books because John Major is doing it for you," as a way to advertise the reviewing. What is a bad book? What makes a book really bad in your experience?
Well, first of all, the style of writing. A badly written book is hard to get through, and it's hard to extract the ideas and information in a badly written book. So, I mean, that's been true for my own work. I try to have role models as a writer, and that goes all the way back to high school. And I think the one thing that I learned in high school was how to write a good paragraph, and that has stayed with me for the next 60 years. And so I look for that. I look for reliable information. Here's a book proposing a thesis. Do I find it persuasive? Do I find the supporting arguments valid? Is it something that arouses my interest? Something that I didn't know before? So I'm looking for something fresh and well written and well argued. And the books are out there. Sometimes you hit upon a book that is really a revelation. And Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, for example, was a book that I found very interesting. The notion of how geography affected the development of civilization in different parts of Eurasia was really eye-opening, and I like that. So, and
Yeah, it's a nice feeling.
back further, when I was still in an academic career, Giorgio de Santia's book Hamlet's Mill was very influential for me because it's used myth as a vehicle for conveying cultural knowledge, what we would call memes now, but that word didn't exist back then. And that really was eye-opening to me. I found this is very persuasive, that mythology was a way of transmitting cultural information, vital cultural information, from generation to generation in societies that were not necessarily literate. So things like that set up a spark in your mind and lead your thinking into new directions, and that's very exciting.
Do you regret, to some extent, not having had the possibility of mentoring students? Is it something that, in retrospect, you would have liked to have done?
The only regret I have is that it meant I didn't have a large number of students and be involved in their careers. I always loved teaching. I loved being in the classroom. I didn't love faculty meetings. I didn't love committee work. I certainly didn't love grading, but I did love teaching, and I missed that. But I was able to make up for that to some extent. I guest lecturing and being a visiting professor for a year here and there. And so that was a way of overcoming that element of regret. But really, I didn't look back. It was the right decision, and it's worked out well.
Yes, as I said, you had this impressive career working at night, which is a very, very, yeah, impressive, inspiring, and also requires dedication and faith, all the things that you mentioned. I want to circle back to, you mentioned you had this collaboration with Sarah Quinn, but you also worked with Connie Cook about the true religion and other scholars. What is the secret, again, asking for someone who is entering the field, for a good editor or a good collaborator in this case?
Most of my work has been collaborative. Not all. Some of the finance work is mine alone, and that's fine. I enjoyed that work, and I was glad to do it on my own. And yet, when it came down to the complete translation of the finance, it was clear that a collaborative approach was going to be best. Again, there was a funny sort of background to that. I ran into Hal Roth at a meeting of the Association of Asian Studies, and we were chatting. We were old friends. And I said, Hal, I'm thinking of doing a complete translation of the White House. And Hal said, oh, that's interesting. I'm thinking the same thing. And so we decided to combine forces, and then we wound up adding Sarah Queen and Andy Meyer to the group. And the product of that collaboration is far better, I'm convinced, than it would have been if any one of us had tried to do the whole text on our own. One thing that makes me really proud of that book is that the tone of the book is uniform throughout the 1,000 pages. And that's true, even though one or another of us was responsible for the initial translation of this chapter or that chapter. We worked very hard to get a uniform voice. And that involved, believe it or not, 2 years where we spent weekends, not every weekend, but a few weekends a year for 2 years, reading the final draft aloud in part for the group. With one person would read, and the others would have the text in front of them. And if anything caught someone's attention, you say stop, and if there was a problem, we would fix it. There was a case where the draft used a term in a way that we had not tried to use it. We fixed that, and so it comes across as a genuine collaboration. It's input from 4 people who were willing to put aside their ego and accept criticism and to not have bruised feelings. And it worked out really well. And I think that it would be good if there were more collaborative work of that kind. It's unfortunately not encouraged in the academic world. If you have a book that's written with a partner, it doesn't count as a full book for you. It counts half a book because you have someone else working with you. And that kind of short-sightedness in looking at academic production, I think, is really unfortunate.
Was it always the case, or do you think it became more so because, you know, with this idea that to get tenure, you need at least a book that is just your baby? Do you think it's something that became more so in the last years?
Yeah, it became more restrictive. When I entered the academic world in 1971, that was the last year, I think, that every graduate student at Harvard who wanted a job got a job. And after that, it became competitive. In the 1960s, John Fairbank would go through the list of graduating graduate students and say, okay, Major goes to the University of Colorado, and someone goes to the University of Michigan, and someone goes to this place or that place. And it's like Papa Fairbank was taking care of his children. And that cohort came up through the ranks, and suddenly, by the late 70s, all of these very good young scholars were coming up for tenure at the same time. And the criteria for tenure became much more restrictive. And as you say, you have to have a book which is your own and only your own, and collaboration gets you nowhere. And that I think was very unfortunate. And I'm not sure, because I'm not intimately involved in the academic world anymore, but I think it's still true that you're supposed to be the lone scholar out creating new knowledge and not being part of a group that is working together.
I think there is maybe a bit that idea, if anything, in the moment of production of your dissertation or your book or your work, and then conferences often allow for exchanges of ideas. But there is also quite some collaboration going on among scholars. Speaking of, again, this career that you had, and the fact that you had this position, and you still do, of being part of the academic world. You know all the professors, you have done this amazing research, but you were outside it. How did you, what privilege did that position give you?
Well, I was very deliberate about keeping my academic ties. So even though I wasn't in the academic world in terms of earning my living, I was very careful to always go to the AAS meetings and the Society for the Study of Early China, and to accept invitations to give guest lectures, and to maintain friendships in the field. And that allowed me to have a quasi-academic career, even though I wasn't in the academy. But you have to work at it. I think a lot of independent scholars wind up feeling isolated and not really part of the scholarly world, and that's unfortunate. You have to keep those ties up, and yeah, it's unfortunate to see some people who are very talented who are sidelined as independent scholars, and some of it is luck, some of it is hard work, some of it's talent. But I was lucky. Things worked out well for me.
I want to ask, because now it's a very discussed topic, as it should be, about women in the field, and how, again, you had this very privileged position, or a different position, if anything, where you could observe what was going on and you were involved, but you didn't have to, that was not feeding you. The academic job was not the source of your income. So how did you see the field change, also with an eye on the position of women?
Well, my wife teases me about having all the collaborators are women. And it's true, this is just a matter of personality, but going back to my teenage years, most of my good friends have been women. And I don't know why that is, but it's just the way my life has worked out. And so I've been part of a movement of women into the academic world in my own little sphere of influence, because it's very congenial to me. But when I was on the faculty at Dartmouth, for example, we were just then becoming aware of the need to expand the faculty and to expand the role of women in the faculty. And I remember in some of the hirings we did in the 1970s, where we were making a deliberate effort to appeal to women candidates. And that was a very good thing. The history department was all the better for having an increased number of women. And I think that has still gone on. There are plenty of women in the academy now, but I hear from women friends that they still feel discriminated against and disrespected and undervalued. And I'm afraid that some of my male colleagues have very reactionary attitudes about women in the academy and make those attitudes known. And I think that's very regrettable. I don't know what to do about it, but it is subject to great regret.
Yeah, it creates an atmosphere that is.
Baffles me, actually. Why get upset about the idea that women are in the faculty? Maybe they think they're taking jobs away from more deserving men or something. I don't know. It just seems screwy to me. I don't understand it. But there it is. I can't dismiss the experiences of my women friends who find that they are not invited to meetings where their contributions in the discussion are cut short, where male colleagues just give them the cold shoulder. I don't understand it.
I'm afraid I don't have an answer either. So, but I wanted to ask this question because, as you mentioned, things have improved considerably from what I hear and from all that female professors who are older than me tell me. And yet there is still this concern that it's very much present, as you mentioned. Some women still feel excluded from the conversation. So I was curious to hear your opinion about it, and to keep on this idea of the field changing, just in terms of topics, in terms of what is being studied, in terms of how the field itself developed. What were the major changes that you saw through the years?
Well, one change is very much for the better, and that is the language skills and research skills of the younger professors now are really impressive and better than my cohort and better than most of the people older than I in the academy. This rigorous teaching of language is a real step forward. And I'm deeply impressed by the research skills and the linguistic skills of younger colleagues. I think that's great. There is a tendency, I think, to be rather narrow in focus and to curb your curiosity and stick to the one research pathway that has been laid out for you. And I think that's too bad. It's nice to see people who range widely and who are not afraid to take up new ideas and new directions and follow them. And yet, again, it comes back to the tenure issue. You're supposed to have one book, 2 books is better. 2 books and 10 articles is very much better. And that involves just cranking stuff out and sticking to one topic and milking it for all it's worth. And that's unfortunate.
I'm curious again to hear your opinion about it. Sometimes I have conflicting feelings about the fact that the departments of East Asian languages and cultures were established. You were part of the Department of History, right? And sometimes I have the feeling that maybe being part of being more in conversation with the historians of European culture, the philosophers of European culture, or the linguists, would actually make the studies, the Chinese studies, much more known. It seems to me that sometimes the departments of East Asian anything become a way also to be isolated, to be very specific, but just to have a conversation between ourselves, essentially. And you saw the formation of these departments. I'm just curious to hear, your opinion about this.
I'm not sure how to answer that. Tell me more about what you mean by this question.
Well, what I mean is that they were all created, the Oriental Institutes, the departments of Oriental Studies all go back a long way, right?
Yeah.
But in many ways, Oriental was anything that was not European, right? So there was this conflation of a lot of different cultures. And then over time, we saw the establishment instead of departments that were much more specialized. So now we have the East Asian studies, the Near East studies, the Indian studies sometimes, the African studies, and so on. And I'm curious to know how what you thought might have been an impact of this being more and more specialized, being more and more divided too, instead of having, being a scholar of Chinese history, but working in the Department of History.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. I was very lucky in my career to be nicely treated by senior members in the field. I'm not quite sure how this happened, but people that I had no formal connection to took an interest in me and encouraged me. People like Ed Schaefer at Berkeley and H.G. Creel at Chicago and David Nivison at Stanford, and these famous names, Joseph Needham especially, took an interest in my career. And these were people who knew China from front to back, and who would publish on a very wide range of topics. And I learned that from them, that you could do that, and it was important to do that. And I think that that wide-ranging field of sinology has become shrunken and narrow, so that you have students with superb research skills, but they're applying them in ways that are sometimes very narrow and, to me, not so interesting. There also was, in the 80s, especially the 70s and 80s, a kind of pathetic adherence to the new emerging field of cultural theory, where the program for the AAS annual meeting looked like a pale reflection of the MLA annual meeting, with lots of parentheses and catchy puns in the titles of papers, and appeals to Lacan and Derrida and a bunch of other French intellectuals. And it just struck me as weak and pathetic. You don't really need to dress up your work in a lot of obfuscating phrases. You can be much more straightforward. And so that struck me as a kind of scholarly dead end that a lot of people were unfortunately making their way to. Yeah, it's unfortunate that there is this specialization, and now also there's a new element coming into the dialogue, and that is the issue of appropriation. Is it even legitimate for people like me to study China? Some people would say no, that I am a practitioner of Orientalism, and I have no ethno-linguistic legitimacy, and all that package of things that comes with the idea of appropriation and neo-colonialism. I'm glad I don't have to deal with that. I'm well out of the academic argument for that, and I'm happy about that.
You mentioned Joseph Needham, who is
Yes.
one of my heroes. So now I must ask, how did you meet him, and what was it like?
He was a wonderful man. He was brilliant, of course, but also so gracious and kind. It was really a privilege to know him. I met him first in the international, what was it called, the International Conference of Orientalists, I think was the name at the time, in Tokyo in 1971. And just made bold to go up and have a conversation with him. And then later in that first year of my teaching at Dartmouth, so the spring of '72, I wrote to him and said, could I come to Cambridge and look at some of the papers he had on Finance of Three. He had a copy of Herbert Shatley's handwritten draft translation of the astronomical chapter of the Finance, and I wanted to see that. And he said, yeah, come ahead. So I spent 2 weeks in Cambridge and got to know him better. And he was very gracious in sharing the materials he had. And we kept in touch. And in about 1974 or 75, he said to me, would I be willing to edit some materials he had on Korean astronomical instruments, which were not directly part of Science and Civilization in China, but he had a lot of material that could turn into a book. So I said, sure, I'd love to do that. And so in due course, there came to my office at Dartmouth 3 big cardboard boxes full of an immense amount of stuff, completely unorganized and undigested. Things written on backs of envelopes and on paper napkins. Just an unbelievable task of getting that sorted out. And so for the next few years, I was trying to make sense of that. And fortunately, in '81, '82, I had a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall in Cambridge. So I was able to spend a year working on that book with Edom and with our mechanical engineering partner, John Combridge. And that was how that book got finished, the Hall of Penalty Records. And without that year in Cambridge, I think the book would never have come to pass. But working closely with Edom was really a marvelous thing because he was such a lovely man. He would recite poetry. He would think of an idea and go to his bookshelf, take a book off the shelf, turn to the right page. Something maybe he hadn't looked at for 10 years, but he knew exactly where it was. He was an extraordinary man.
What poetry would he recite?
He had a favorite poem by Rudyard Kipling called Our Fathers of Old. Excellent herbs have our fathers of old, excellent herbs to cure all ills. And he goes on to name various herbs, and precious little our forefathers knew, precious little to heal all ills. Most of their remedies cured you dead. Much of their knowledge was quite untrue. I only can remember scraps of it, but listening to him recite that poem was just wonderful. He did it with a twinkle in his eye.
Did he ever recite Chinese poetry?
Not that I remember. I'm sure he could have, but
yes.
No, I don't
that
remember.
is so wonderful. You mentioned that you met him in Japan, and this is also something that, to my perception, has changed slightly. I know a lot of scholars, your generation and in between, that were very active in Japan. And now it seems that if you want to do early China, if you want to research early China, Japan is not so relevant anymore. Is that correct?
Yeah, and when I was starting out, there was no access to China. And of course, there was Academia Sinica in Taiwan, but that had its limits. And the great universities of Japan were a magnet for young scholars to use research libraries that had remarkable materials and to get to know some Japanese scholars like Fujieda Akira, who were affiliated with the Jinmun Kakaku Kenkyusho, the Research Institute for Humanistic Studies. And so it was a new form of mentorship to study with those scholars and to use the resources available at the University of Kyoto, for example. I guess that's not being done so much anymore, but it's unfortunate. People who don't have that experience are missing out on something.
Yes, I feel I am too, in a sense. Even after in the 80s, 90s, when China was more open, there was still this sense that Japan was very important. And now maybe it's my shortcoming too. I'm sure it is. But it seems that working in China and Taiwan, as you mentioned, comes first, of course. When it comes to early China, not necessarily with all fields. But I'm now curious, when did you first go to China?
Well, my generation was precluded from that, and there was no access to China. Now it's routine for graduate students to spend a year or 2 years or more in China, and to that extent, they benefit from improved language skills and getting to know a wide range of Chinese colleagues. So there's a trade-off. They're not getting the Japan experience, but they're getting much more of a China experience than I ever had. And that's all to the good.
Did you spend a lot of time in Taiwan, and once you were able to access China?
Taiwan was, for me, involved two things. One was to work on my language skills. And I had a tutor to work on classical Chinese with me, and that was very useful. And the other thing was, what was it like to be Chinese? Taiwan was still very traditional at that time and very underdeveloped. I rented a little house in Taichung, and I was a 5-minute walk from the rice fields. And I could go out and watch what the farmers were doing and learn from that. Or I could walk the other way down the road and come to a Taoist temple and hang out at the Taoist temple and see what people were doing. And that was my first real exposure to traditional Chinese life. And it was eye-opening. It was very unfocused. I was like a sponge taking everything in. If it was relevant to something, it was fine. If it was not relevant, something was also fine. Just the experience was the important part. Went back a few years later, and not only could I not find my old house, I couldn't find my old street. The city had expanded so much that the development was on its way, and the old town of Taichung was transformed. So I'm glad I had the experience when I had it.
Yes, this is something else that sometimes I feel I'm missing, that seeing both China and Taiwan before the big expansion. Now I'm circling back, thinking of things that you said. You said you learned to write a good a good paragraph when you were in
high school,
and you were looking for inspirations in writers. So which writers inspired you?
I took Abraham Lincoln as a model. I took, when it came time for it, I took Joseph Needham as a model. He's a great prose stylist. And it was not so much taking things from one person or another, but just reading a lot and trying to absorb the experience of what was graceful and coherent and attractive about a piece of writing. And that involved some mundane things like just learning grammar. I'm amazed now when I do peer reviews of papers, which I do fairly frequently. I'm amazed at how graduate students at good institutions do not know English grammar. It strikes me as rather shocking. And
I hope you never read one of my papers then. But yes, I think again, part of the being specialized sometimes had that feeling that you're giving up other skills, presentational skills, writing well in a language that is not your own, sometimes get sacrificed. I think this is maybe fair to say. Okay, I will go and work on my grammar then very assiduously. You said so many interesting things, and now I keep going back and forth because you mentioned, you Joseph Needham, and you knew Joseph Needham. You also knew his work very well. I am curious now about his study. This became a controversial topic. Why was there no scientific revolution in China?
Yeah.
What is your opinion on that and the debate that followed in the 80s?
It was a useful question to launch that project. And Science and Civilization is one of the marvels of scholarship of our time. It really is astonishing. It turns out that it was the wrong question. And why did China not have the scientific revolution just is not an interesting thing to think about. It's overdetermined. You say, well, China did have a scientific revolution of sorts, but that gets you nowhere. You say that technology was highly advanced in China, but the theory to explain how the technology worked was not highly developed. There are all sorts of ways of approaching that, but I think the Needham question, as it's called, was useful as a heuristic device, but is not an interesting question in the long run. There are too many factors. And a lot of history is contingent. If the Chinese had learned to tax commerce in a more efficient and fair and effective way, they might have gotten further along the road toward true scientific explanations of things, rather than investing in a obsolete cosmology that was devised in the Han Dynasty. So there are economic factors involved. As it is, merchants bought land and tried to turn their children and grandchildren into bureaucrats and degree holders rather than investing in machinery for their workshops. And so what would have happened if merchants were more esteemed and not put at the bottom of the social ladder as they were in China? What if translations of Chinese, European scientific works into Chinese had occurred earlier? There might have been more ebb and flow of information in both directions that would have changed the way the world developed. Things happen when they happen, and you only get so far with what ifs.
Yes, you do. But I agree with you that as a question, it was one worth asking. So again, talking about what are the good questions to ask when it comes to doing research. Where do you see the field, and in this case, I mean the field of ancient China, so early China, including Han Dynasty. Where do you see it going in the next 20 years, if you had to make a prediction?
I think overwhelmingly it will revolve around excavated texts. The amount of material coming out of the ground in China is just astonishing. And material is coming out much faster than it can be studied and conserved and transcribed. So there's going to be more and more stuff available, and it will be transformative. There are dozens of books in the Han Dynasty where we know the titles, where the content no longer exists. And some of those are going to come out of the ground, and we will have books that we knew existed, which were missing for 2,000 years. And suppose we find multiple copies of the Analects. That will say a lot about how intellectual life was organized in the Warring States in the Han period. What if we find calendrical materials that we learn much more about how the calendar was devised and what the political considerations were? I mean, there are all kinds of things, but that's going to be the focus. And it'll take all of the energy of all of the early China people for a long time to get a handle on those materials. Yeah, there's just so much material that nobody can get a handle on it anymore. So it's going to take a lot of, it's not necessarily collaborative work, at least awareness of work being done in the field. Sharing information is going to be a critical thing to try to get some notion of what all this new material is telling us. Not only text, but as you say, objects and material culture. Already some of the tombs of the Han regional kings are being excavated now, and extraordinary materials coming out of there. And it's just copper coins by the ton, for example. It's mind-boggling. So we'll learn things about relations between the center and the periphery. And we will get a better handle on how the regional kings interacted with the emperor. And was the Han Dynasty really as centralized as we thought it was, or is it more diffuse? Those questions will be askable and answerable to some extent in the next decade. And it's very exciting.
It is in many ways. That is true. What about now the field of sinology more broadly? Of course, a lot of study now goes towards the area of Xinjiang for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I'm encouraged that there's still a lot of interest in pre-modern China. Obviously, a lot of people go into the China field now, looking at current political and economic situation. That's fine. But the fact that there is still a lot of interest in the Song Dynasty, a lot of interest in the Ming Dynasty, is, to my mind, an unalloyed good thing. And I hope that that keeps going. And I hope that younger scholars will feel freer to write on subjects outside their main line of expertise. I think it's good for everybody for that to happen. So when I can, I encourage younger colleagues to spread their wings a little bit and undertake new research directions that perhaps will give them some surprises.
What would be a good topic for someone who does early China, like to spread their wings? Sometimes I work with scholars from the Qing Dynasty, the philologists, for obvious reasons. But at the same time, I do feel I'm still doing ancient texts. So what would be maybe a good topic for someone in my position to spread their wings?
I am hoping that someone will undertake a study that I once thought of doing myself and realized that it was too big for me. And that is what I call two cultural styles in early China, the coastal riverine style and the continental style. You have states like Qi and Wu and Yue on the eastern edge of China. And you have the imperial capital at Chang'an and the immense North China plain, where if you stand in Zhengzhou, for example, look around you, it's impossible to think that there's a huge ocean, not all that far away. It's completely landlocked and continental and looking toward the west, looking toward the trade routes. And the East Coast gives you connections to Korea, to Japan, Vietnam, and it's a completely different cultural style. And I would like somebody to explore that and to see how those two styles interacted. That's what got me interested in Chu, for example, because it's coastal and riverine. You go down the coast and there's the Yangtze River and you follow that up to Sichuan. And you get a very different culture in the Chu region than you have in the north. And that still has a lot of work to be done on it and a lot of processing of archaeological materials and a lot of widening of vision. I think it's a very interesting topic and I hope somebody will pick it up and make that an important part of their scholarship.
Yeah, it is. I admit I read your book on the one you edited with Connie, and I didn't really think in those terms of these two cultures that were developing, but it's absolutely true that it is a very central topic. I'm now curious about, we're having this conversation also because of COVID, what is happening in this last year. And I'm curious to know how your research has been doing, in the last year with the presence of COVID. And I assume you have an amazing library at home, but I'm curious to know what you've been working on and the strains or the possibilities sometimes that COVID brought to you.
Well, of course, on a personal level, it's been very stifling to not be able to go out and see friends and have dinners at restaurants and all of the social things that we took for granted and which turned out not to be taken for granted after all. In terms of scholarship, yeah, there's some question of getting access to materials. The libraries are closed. But mostly I've been able to rely on my own library, which is not that big, but which is adequate for the studies that I do. And so intellectually, it hasn't been that bad. And the Columbia Early China Seminar continues to meet via Zoom. And that's not the same as being in the room with a bunch of your colleagues, but it is okay as a stopgap. So yeah, in terms of scholarship, it hasn't made that much of a difference to me. Right now, I'm working with Ann Kinney on a translation of the Shifu Lun, Wang Fu's collection of essays. And that's a manageable project. You don't need a huge library to work on that. It's a very difficult text. The text is in poor shape and there are grammatical problems that are difficult to solve, but it is not affected by the pandemic. Work away and it will emerge at some point.
Again, I'm curious as a young scholar who is thinking about, trying to have models for my own career, but also I have, we students see all these big names and new professors being so established, and we don't often get to hear the struggles that you also went through, right? The same way we do now when we start our career. So when did you feel that you were mastering classical Chinese? Was there a moment when you felt, okay, now I'm actually confident working with this language?
Yeah, it took a while. But classical Chinese is a very attractive language. I like the compression, I like the economy. It can be quite beautiful. And one of the pleasures of working on the Huainanzi is that it's so well written. The Chuncho Fan Lu, not so much. That is kind of boring, and it was a matter of just getting through it. But yeah, there's an aesthetic pleasure in working on classical Chinese text for me. I guess it was when I chose as my dissertation topic translation, very heavily annotated translation of Untitled Chapter 4, that I realized, yeah, I can do this. And that was a make or break time. If that hadn't worked out, I would have left the field and done something else. But it worked out okay.
Yeah, and then gladly so for the rest of us. Yes, I was asking this question because, again, sometimes I have the feeling I don't know exactly. I moved from being very confident with the language, then all of a sudden opening, as you say, something like the Chunju Fanlu or other works, and it just
Well,
I begin to be lost again.
I'm finding this with the Chifu Lun. Sometimes there'll be a sentence there, what the hell is this trying to say? And it takes a while to puzzle it out. So it's not as if I sit down and read classical Chinese like I'm reading a comic book. It still is work, but it's rewarding, so it's worth doing.
Again, going back and forth about Creole, you work with Creole, and now the name for us, for my generation, is the Creole Center for Paleography in Chicago.
Yes.
But you worked with the person to which this center is dedicated. So I'm also curious about him, both as a scholar and as a person.
Well, he had a reputation for being short-tempered, but I never saw that. He was always very gracious to me. And I was really touched at one of the AAS meetings. There was a panel, kind of commemorative panel of Creel's career, looking back over his work from the birth of China onward. And he specifically asked that I should be on that panel. And I was really touched by that because I was never his student. And we had this epistolary relationship. And somehow he saw something in my work that appealed to him and wanted to encourage that. And I was very moved by that. So to the extent that he was a ferocious mentor, I never saw it. It was just encouraging. Well, I would just say as advice to young faculty, be sure to leave room to be interested in a number of things. Don't let your life be entirely consumed by whatever research you're doing. Become a bird watcher or learn to do skateboarding or something. But don't be so narrow as to let your work define you in a complete way. You should have other interests and other ways of engaging with the world.
So now I must ask, do you say this because you saw it happening? You saw people becoming completely absorbed by their work in ways that maybe were too extreme?
Yeah, I don't have intimate knowledge of that, but I certainly knew students in recent years who I thought were allowing themselves to become too narrow, and that struck me as unfortunate. You get one ride on the merry-go-round, and you may as well make it an interesting one.
Okay, again, I feel very good now because I have all this, I read books that have nothing to do with China. I am now reading a very interesting biography of Richard Yates, for example, which is also, I admire him immensely as a writer, and the biography goes through years and years when his work was just rejected one after another, one short story after another. So it's also helping in that sense, the idea that it may take some time to actually get where you want to do, where you want to go.
Yes.
Yeah, and you do more other things. Meanwhile, in his case, it was a lot of drinking, which is not really appropriate. But there are other things to do in life, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to thank you very, very much for this conversation. I had a lot of fun. I hope you
This has
did too.
been great fun, great pleasure. So
I'm very glad.
thank you for including me in this project. Well, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the time, and we'll be in touch.
Yes, absolutely.